Clients and friends, wanted to thank you for joining us this afternoon for a discussion today on sustainable income and retirement and some of the retirement planning work that we do here at Liberty Wealth Advisors. As a matter of housekeeping, and before we get started with our presentation, I just want to direct everyone's attention to the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. You should see an icon that has enabled the question and answer feature. So you're eligible to send over some questions to us during the presentation. As we go through today's content, any questions coming to mind, ideas, feel free to share them to us in the chat, and we'll be able to address those towards the end of the presentation, certainly if time allows. All right, let's jump right into our agenda. So what are we talking about this afternoon? First, I'll just talk a little bit very briefly about Liberty Wealth Advisors and our services, introduce our speakers this afternoon, and then we'll get right into our presentation talking about retirement planning and, what is identifying your overall cost of retirement? How do you assess if you're on track or not throughout the course of retirement? And then certainly, there's a whole lot of other miscellaneous planning considerations that we think are of valuable discussion and noteworthy to share with you this afternoon. So we'll be covering that. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters here this afternoon. Two of our advisors will be leading the discussion. First, we have Ashley Scott. She's one of our financial planners and advisors on our team, has been with Liberty Wealth since 2018, but has been working in the insurance and financial services industry for over a decade now. She has her certified financial planner designation, and Ashley works out of our Michigan office here in Royal Oak. So part of the good old Midwest nice crew, as I sometimes like to call it, but certainly not part of the Midwest crew, but definitely nice. Rich Mahar, he's also one of our team members and colleagues, financial advisor and planner. Will also be joining the discussion today. In addition to his CFP, Rich also has the Charter Financial Analyst designation. Prior to joining Liberty Wealth, had over a 20-year career with an international wealth management firm as a portfolio manager and strategist. So certainly bringing a lot to today's conversation as well. And then finally, audience, just a reminder of some of the additional resources and work that we have available to you as our clients. Many of you know us in the context of an investment management firm, but we provide many other financial planning resources and can help you in a whole host of different areas. So please think of us first, when you're considering adjacent areas of your financial life. We want to be your first stop and your first team and resource that you reach out to with any questions about your financial life. All right, well, enough of that preamble. Let's get right into it. And let's start with the topic of this concept of determining your overall cost of retirement. And to kick things off here, Ashley, let's start with you. And what can you share with us to kind of frame up our conversation today?
Thanks, Annette, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. When thinking about retirement planning, we think it's helpful to start with an equation. And it's a simple equation because there's no math involved. But what it does involve is 3 different levels of control. There are things that we have no control over, and then things that we have some and total control over, and all of these are going to play into a sound retirement plan. So let's start with things that we have no control over. And the big thing here is the markets. Unfortunately, there's no crystal ball or no economist anywhere in the world that's accurately going to be able to predict the future markets. The irony here is that this is what's in front of our faces every day on the news: geopolitics, elections, wars, things that are more likely to cause emotional triggers, which in turn can cause investors to make suboptimal decisions. There are things that we have some control over. To some extent, we have control over how long we work and how long we live. And by that, we mean staying active, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, that sort of thing. And then there are 2 simple things that we have total control over: saving and spending. And by saving, what we really mean is investing. I think it's important to notate that difference. And we hope to provide some clarity around all of these decisions today. Next slide, please. So one of the first questions, or one of the first things to think about, is how long are we going to be in retirement, or your time horizon? And really, when thinking about retirement, how long are we going to live? And so to read through this chart, if you could find yourself at the bottom, my example is going to be, I'm going to pretend like we're married or a member of a couple. And the question that we're answering here, if we're 65 today, what is the likelihood of one of us living to a specific age? The darker shaded bars are going to be someone in average health, and then the lighter shade is going to be somebody in excellent health. So at age 65, you have a 71% probability of living to age 85 in average health, and a 90% probability of living to age 85 in excellent health. Moving out 10 years, we have a 15% chance of living to age 95 in average health. But in excellent health, we have a 46, almost 50% chance of living to age 95. And so what is the takeaway here? In general, we need to plan for a long life or a long time horizon. And in general, life expectancies are just averages. And so we may or may not be average. So now that we understand that we need sustainable income for life, let's talk about income replacement. And the question here is, how much of our pre-retirement income do we need to replace in retirement? And the industry rule of thumb is between 75 and 80%, although it does vary by household income level. So let's look at an example. And to read through this chart, the purple line graph towards the top represents the income replacement rate. And by income replacement rate, again, it's the pre-retirement income that we're replacing in retirement. The gray bars are going to represent changes in expenses, so mainly taxes and pre-retirement savings. The green represents Social Security, and the blue represents the amount that's going to be funded through private and employer sources. So you can find your pre-retirement income at the bottom of the page. It starts at $30,000 and goes out to $300,000, and these are gross income figures, but I'm going to use an example of $100,000. So with $100,000 pre-retirement income, if we subtract the 14% change in expenses, we get 86%, which is the income replacement rate that we see at the top. And then 44% of your retirement will be funded through Social Security, leaving 42% to be funded through private sources. So think 401ks, IRAs, or other savings accounts. Next slide, please. And you may have seen a similar graphic before. This is sometimes referred to as a smile curve. And what this represents is how our spending may change in retirement. What we see in early retirement is that our clients are more active. They do a lot more traveling. As they get older, they slow down a little bit. And then as we continue to age, sometimes advanced medical care is needed. And the cost of this care is going to increase by the level of care that's required. And so we tend to see retirement become more expensive again later in life. And so what is the takeaway from these last few slides? This is just a starting point. Retirement planning involves so many different factors, and we believe it's so important to work with an advisor to help account for different scenarios or different things that could occur.
Thank you for sharing that, Ashley. I think you ended with a really good thought there. I think this is just initial food for thought, right? It's very dynamic, but now that we've started off kind of with this idea of, have you considered what your cost of retirement might be? Where do we go from here? So how do we start, gauging, are we on track? Are we covering all our various bases? There's so much to discuss there. Rich, perhaps let's start with you and see where you could kick us off with on this topic.
Great. Thanks, Annette, and welcome, everyone. I think one of the things that will hopefully be obvious today is that there's so many decisions that go into retirement planning. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, and that can lead to inaction or a lack of planning. And that's something that we definitely want to avoid. So I do think that it is very critical to plan as much as you can for a very uncertain future. And it's also apparent to me when working with clients that they often want to know the answer. They want to know, what should we invest in? What should our asset allocation be? How much in equities? How much in bonds? How much should we have in the Magnificent Seven? Should I put my whole life savings into Bitcoin, etc.? So we definitely don't recommend that last one. But I do think it is understandable that we want to move forward to the answer and know what our asset allocation should be. But we actually think that that's a later step in the process. And a very important first step is to first identify and do an inventory of the accounts that you already hold. Or if you're relatively new in this process, you want to start to create those accounts and prioritize how they should be funded. So this schematic is one of the ways that we typically prioritize the funding of the various accounts that you'll need in retirement. And, I'll emphasize this is everybody's different, everybody's unique. So this may not apply to everyone, but I think it's a pretty good guide for most people. So we like to start at the bottom of the schematic. The first thing that we think you should create is a rainy day fund or an emergency fund. And why is that? Well, because life is uncertain. By definition, things are going to happen, and you'll have expenditures that you're not expecting. And you want to be able to make those expenditures with cash that you hold. You don't want to have to sell assets after a downturn. And you also don't want to acquire heavy interest rate debt or credit card debt in particular. We typically recommend that you have 3 to 12 months of your living expenses set aside in a rainy day fund or a cash reserve fund. And then next, working our way up the schematic, the next point or account that we think you should focus on is maximizing your contributions to defined contribution plans such as 401ks. You want to maximize your contributions to maximize your employer's match. If you don't do that, you're literally giving away money. So you want to contribute at the very least up to the point that maximizes the employer match. And then from there, you should pay down high rate interest loans. So that would be credit cards in particular. And then if you have cash flow left over, you should maximize additional contributions to 401ks and defined contribution plans, as well as health savings accounts or HSAs. And the reason for that is because of the tax benefits. And a little bit later on, Ashley will be talking in particular about health savings accounts and the benefits of those. And then from there, again, if you're able to, you should pay down lower interest rate loans. So we generally want to avoid debt that excludes your mortgage. So there's different reasons to hold a mortgage, of course, but outside of the mortgage, we're big fans of paying down debt. And then continuing up the chart, if you're eligible to make additional contributions to IRAs, that's great. And then finally, the last account that you should be funding, we believe, is a taxable account. And, don't get me wrong, we want you to have very large taxable accounts. We just think that is the last type of account you should prioritize. And so as a checkpoint, if you wouldn't mind the next slide, Annette, I think an important checkpoint is determining how much you need in savings in order to replace a desired level of income. And so how does this chart work? Well, you want to find the household income across the horizontal axis at the top that you would like to replace in retirement. And then on the left side, the vertical axis, find your current age, and then find the intersection of those 2 points. And so what this indicates is how much you should have in savings at that point, or at this point, in order to replace that desired level of income in retirement. So the example that we're using here, and you can see the red circle, is someone that's 40 years old who needs to or wants to replace $100,000 of income in retirement. How much would they need in savings today to accomplish that? Well, it tells us it would be $185,000. And so a couple messages there. One is, well, what if you're behind? What if you don't have 185,000? I definitely wouldn't panic. However, what I would focus on is improving your status by the next checkpoint. So by the time you're 45 in this example, you would hope to have 285,000 set aside in investments. And the way to do that would be by reducing your expenses, making additional savings, and then possibly changing your asset allocation to deliver higher returns. And then another checkpoint is, how much do you need to save in order to reach these goals? And so what this chart is showing us is what percent of your income would you need to save on an annual basis if you were starting today? So you had no savings and you were starting today. Again, we'll use the example that we used previously. And so if you're 40 years old and you need to replace $100,000 of income in retirement, then the savings rate that's associated with that would be 20%. And 20% of your income may sound pretty daunting, but I think it's achievable. And what's clear from the chart is that it actually gets more difficult the later you wait, or the longer you wait. And so we see, if you didn't start today and you're 40, but you plan to start when you're 45, then at that point you would need to start saving 29% of your income. And if you were waiting till or if you waited until you're 50, you would have to save almost double. You would have to save 42%, or more than double, 42% of your income. So I think that's a pretty clear message here. The earlier that you start, to the extent you can take advantage of a long time horizon, the better off you'll be, and start investing or start saving and investing as early as you can in your life cycle. So to this point, we've talked a fair amount about the accumulation phase and the savings. And now at this point, we'll shift gears a little bit, and Ashley will comment on the decumulation phase and the spending in retirement.
Thanks, Rich. And we thought it would be helpful to take a deeper dive into some of these account types and just some of the things to keep an eye out for. And so let's start at the top with the health savings account. This is sometimes referred to as an HSA, and not everybody is eligible to contribute. If you are eligible to contribute, contributions are tax deductible, and they can be invested and they grow within the HSA tax-free. And then when we go to take a withdrawal, as long as the withdrawals are used for qualified medical expenses, they're going to be tax-free. This is sometimes referred to as a triple tax benefit. At age 65, you are able to take the funds from an HSA and use them for any reason. However, if they're not used for those qualified medical expenses, you will pay ordinary income tax. On the far right column of this page, we see a column for a reduction in government benefits. And what this is speaking to is the amount of Social Security being taxed, or Medicare surcharges, otherwise known as IRMA. And we will touch on both of those things later on. But the takeaway here is that distributions from an HSA do not impact either of those benefits. Moving down, we see the Roth 401k or a Roth IRA. Contributions to a Roth are after tax, so you don't get an immediate tax benefit for making a contribution. But upon retirement, and the magic age is 59 and a half, you're able to take withdrawals from the Roth IRA tax-free. And again, we see that there's no impact to Social Security or Medicare surcharges. And another thing to note with the Roth IRAs is that there's no required minimum distribution. Moving down, the next section, we see a taxable account. Taxable accounts are sometimes referred to as non-qualified or maybe a brokerage, but as its name suggests, it's fully taxable. And we see in that far right column that distributions do impact Social Security and Medicare. Tax-exempt interest is going to be any interest that's exempt from federal taxation. So for example, a municipal bond. Then we see ordinary dividends, qualified dividends, and taxable interest. And in general, these are going to be taxed as ordinary income. And then we see realized capital gains. Capital gains are created or realized when an asset is sold. And based on your income level, you may owe capital gains tax. And then the last bucket that we see, pre-tax 401k or traditional IRAs. These are the most popular types of retirement accounts because of their tax deferral benefits. So contributions made to the account are tax deductible, and they grow tax-free until retirement. And again, the magic age here is 59 and a half. And once you begin withdrawals, you pay ordinary income tax. You see in the far right column that distributions do impact the percentage of Social Security being taxed in IRMA. And required minimum distributions are required from IRAs or 401ks. If you were born in 1951 through 1955 or 59, the RMD age is 73, and it's going to be 75 for those born in 1960 or later. So what is the takeaway from this slide? Not all savings accounts are created equal. There are many nuances, and yet another reason to work with an advisor to help you navigate some of these challenges.
I would agree, or sometimes I more simply even state that's complicated. That slide is complicated. There's a lot going on there, and well said, Ashley. Don't go this alone, folks. Moving on, though, as we were preparing for today's webinar, this is where we're getting into the miscellany. There's so much under this topic of sustainable retirement income planning, and we could do this for 5 more webinars, each an hour long, and I still feel like we're barely scratching the surface. So maybe as far as addressing a couple of areas that I know that are commonly inquired about and discussed and quite popular would be discussions surrounding Social Security, which is a huge part of your retirement income makeup, in addition to maybe some considerations with respect to Medicare. So knowing that we could go so much deeper on these topics, Rich, what could we maybe tee things off with respect to the timing of Social Security?
Sure. So, I think one of the most critical decisions for a lot of investors is the timing of when they start to take their Social Security benefits. And there's really 3 numbers we need to take into account here. The first is age 62. That is when you're first eligible to start taking benefits. The second is age 67. That's known as the full retirement age. And that's when you'll receive 100% of your designated benefits. And then finally, the third number is age 70. That is the last, that's when you have to start taking your benefits. So let me walk you through this slide. There's actually really 2 components to the slide. At the top is covering birth years 1954 or earlier. And then there's a transition period down to, and this is the second part of the slide on the bottom, is birth years starting in 1960 or later. And so I'm going to focus on the bottom of the slide, 1960 or later. And so as I noted, the full retirement age is 67. That's when you will receive 100% of your indicated benefits. And if you started earlier, you'd receive less than your full retirement benefit. However, if you wait and take it later, say at age 70, you receive a larger benefit. So you definitely need to think through those considerations of receiving the benefit earlier, but receiving less of a benefit versus waiting and receiving a larger benefit. And so I'll just use simple math here for all of us, or the benefit of all of us. Let's assume that your full retirement age is 67, and you're going to receive $100,000 of an annual benefit, and then that will incorporate a cost of living adjustment or an inflation adjustment going forward. But in this example, we'll assume that you are set to receive $100,000 at full retirement age of 67. Well, what if you decided to take it earlier? Then that would mean that you're going to receive about 6% less in a benefit on an annual basis. And so if you started at 70, or at age 62, you would receive about $70,000. So 70% of the $100,000 benefit. However, if you waited until your age 70, then you would receive an increase of about 8% a year, and therefore you'd receive $124,000 as your annual benefit if you wait until you're 70. And so this is the thing that a lot of investors wrestle with. How do we, consider the pros and cons of taking early versus later? And this next slide tries to help with that assessment. And so this schematic is a decision tree, which we think can be helpful in thinking through the various considerations in making this decision. It's a pretty complicated slide, so I'm not going to walk through the whole slide today. But I would note that there's really 3 considerations for you to think about and to focus on. The first is, are you receiving a salary? So are you still working? Or do you have adequate levels of investment income or income that you can tap into to tide you over between the age 62 and later? So that's an important consideration. The second consideration, and Ashley had a slide that I think illustrated the concept very nicely earlier, is what do you envision your spending pattern to be in retirement? And then along those lines, so do you think you'll spend a lot in your 60s? Do you plan to travel? Do you plan to, treat yourself to a Ferrari, etc.? So you need to think your spending pattern through. And then you also need to think about what are the expectations for your lifespan or longevity. Typically, the longer you expect to live, if you have good genes, if you have good family history, if you're in good health, the longer you expect to live, all else equal, that would lead you to taking or deferring the benefit to a later age. But, it's a very personal decision. One of the things that we encounter a lot is that we have clients who expect that they're going to live to 80 as opposed to 100. And in their 60s, they want to take advantage of their relatively good health right now that could be declining as they go forward. And they want to travel a lot in their 60s. And that, of course, increases their expenditures and their living expenses. In this case, that person may be more likely, or it's more appropriate for that person to take their benefits starting when they're 62. So it's a very personal decision. The other thing I would add is that while I think that this decision tree and those 3 factors that I told you you should focus on. That's very important. I would encourage you to go through this schematic, but the timing of your Social Security benefits is just one decision you'll be making. And it's the cumulative effect of all the decisions that you make within your retirement plan that is really going to drive the success of your plan over time. So unfortunately, we have access to planning software. We use eMoney that allows us to do a scenario analysis of not just taking benefits, Social Security benefits at 62, 67, 70, but also, what if your expenses go up in your 60s because of traveling? Can you afford to buy that antique car you've always had your eye on, etc. All those decisions together and the cumulative impact of them is what is really going to drive your plan. So again, we'd encourage you to speak with a financial advisor to really come up with a robust plan.
Well, in addition to Social Security, and thanks for sharing some thoughts there on, quite clearly a topic that can get very dynamic and quite personalized. Also, noteworthy and something worth, discussing here. And again, we're just touching on the surface, but another area with respect to Medicare planning and the discussion surrounding surcharges. Ashley, can you walk us through some content there that might be helpful for the audience?
Absolutely, and thank you, Annette. And Medicare is a component of retirement planning, but we could do an entire webinar just on Medicare. So what we wanted to touch on today is IRMA. And of course, Medicare is the federal health insurance program for those 65 and older. And IRMA stands for Income Related Monthly Adjustment Amount. And what that is it's an additional fee that qualifying individuals will pay on top of their existing Part B and Part D premiums. This applies to both original Medicare or Medicare Advantage beneficiaries or Medigap if you have any kind of Medicare supplement plan. And you can receive an initial determination at any time from Social Security. This is going to be based on your modified adjusted gross income from 2 years prior. And if you disagree with the determination, you do have the right to appeal. And so what this graphic illustrates is on the left side, we see the modified adjusted gross income brackets. And then on the right side of the chart, we see the additional premium that may be owed on both Part B and Part D. So again, we could do an entire webinar on Medicare, but I think it's so important to point out IRMA because it comes up often in conversation. And unfortunately, it often comes as a surprise in retirement. So this is yet another thing that an advisor can help you navigate, and you can try to avoid a pitfall here with IRMA.
Yeah, Ashley, I was going to just ask, would you find that quite often retirees are surprised by this, right? Especially if they're not working in concert or partnership with a financial planner who can help assess this. So depending on if a client is doing Roth conversion or rebalancing portfolio, realizing gains or what have you, this, would you agree it's kind of an often neglected area of discussion that surprises people?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's almost a cliff. As soon as you go $1 over the bracket, then you pay this additional fee.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely cause some challenges with retirement planning.
Thank you for pointing that out. Moving on then, and as we're getting into the final parts of our presentation here this afternoon, I want to spend a few moments talking about then alignment. So building out a plan for retirement and what your specific goals are in retirement and how we can bring those two components together, having a plan in place. Rich, can you talk to us a bit about some goals-based management and what that might mean?
Sure. So at the start of the webinar, I joke that when we work with clients, they often want to jump or fast forward to the answer. You know, what should our investment portfolio look like? And I think that there's a tendency to want to set asset allocation based on a forward-looking market view. You know, we love to predict markets, and you know, we're always going to be right at it. You know, we're never going to get it wrong. I'm joking, of course. We don't believe that your asset allocation should be set by a forward-looking market view. We think that's, you know, just very difficult to consistently predict what markets are going to do over the short term. History has shown us that using long time horizons, we can have a much better sense of what returns will be from various asset classes. So rather than a forward-looking view on markets dictating asset allocation, we very strongly believe that you should align your asset allocation with your goals and objectives. And so, and the thing is, we have different goals and objectives, and those different goals and objectives, they have different time horizons. So at the top of the chart, we've outlined three types of goals. Starting on the left is short-term goals. So this would be if a year from now you plan to, or you need to, you know, fund, make a payment to your child's college for their freshman year tuition, or you plan to buy a car in a year and a half. And then moving to the right, if we go all the way to the right, the long-term goals. And so retirement definitely figures in here. These are goals that have a 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30-year time horizons. And you'll note that we believe very strongly that if it's a short-term goal, that the portfolio should be very conservatively positioned. It should be cash or cash-like instruments. But then for long-term goals, where you have a very long time horizon, a very long runway, and you can absorb the inevitable short-term declines in markets, the best way to generate wealth and appreciation over the long term is by having a portfolio that emphasizes equities. And so, you know, I think the bottom of this graph helps to explain the rationale behind that approach. And so again, what we're showing on the bottom graph is the range of, so both high and low returns for bonds and for stocks and bonds and cash, and a blend of 50% equities and bonds. And we're going back 73 years, back to 1950. And so I think this illustrates the concept we're talking about and supports our beliefs in being focused on goals-based portfolio management. So for example, let's say you have to, you know, make an $80,000, you know, payment. I want to call it a gift or donation, but it's a payment to your child's college in a year. If we look at the bottom graph on the left, it can be tempting to say, well, sometimes equities are up 47%. You know, I'm going to fund that $80,000 payment by taking advantage of that high return that equities can offer. Well, great plan, but the problem with equities is that over short periods of time, we can see by the graph, they can be down 39%. So you want to protect principal in this example, and therefore cash is a much more appropriate investment. We can see by the left side of the graph that cash returns, they're never negative, so, or they haven't been historically. They can range up to 14%. I wouldn't expect that, but we see that they're a good way to preserve capital. The problem with cash, though, is over the long term, cash typically doesn't keep pace with inflation. So if we move to the far right side of the graph, we see the range of returns for equities, bonds, a 50-50 mix, and cash, the range of returns for those asset types over rolling 20-year periods. Now we see that, the best way to grow your portfolio over the long term, if you do have a long time horizon, and typically for retirement investing, if you start when you're 40, you do have that long time horizon, then we want to take advantage of that long-term average return that equities provide. So, and historically, a 20-year return for equities has been a low of 6% annualized and a high of 17%. And I think of a long-term average equity return as being in the range of 8 to 10%. So for long-term goals, we want to take advantage of that. And I think that, and I've made jokes about market timing, but I do think that there can be a tendency to look at this graph and say, well, what if I do some market timing and hope to, again, if we look on the left side of the graph, hope to take advantage of that 47% return to stocks that we're occasionally given and avoid the down 39% year through market timing? Well, we would definitely recommend against that. And we're going to use the next slide to talk about why. And so I talked about an average long-term equity return of being between 8 and 10%. And what we're showing on this graph on the left side of the graph is, well, what if in January of 2004, so 20 years ago, we had invested $10,000 in the S&P 500 and we just let it ride. We just kept it there. We didn't try to do any market timing. Well, that 10,000 would now be worth roughly 63,600, and the annualized return would be 9.7%. And so that's squarely in that 8 to 10% long-term return we should expect from markets. And I think for most of us, that is a very good return that compounded over a 20-year period, would help us generate a lot of wealth. And so, but in terms of market timing, what if we tried to be cute? What if we tried to time the market? Well, the danger of that is that there's a very unpredictable nature to the pattern of equity returns. And it also turns out that some of the very best days in the markets are very close to some of the worst down days in the markets. And so, for example, what we're showing as we move to the right of the graph, first starting with what if we missed out on the 10 best days of these last 20 years? What would that mean for our annual return? Well, it almost cuts it in half. It would go from a 9.7% annual return to 5.5%. And then we see that if our very poor market timing leads to missing 20 of the best days, then it cuts it to 2.8%. So what we're hoping to illustrate here, and for those of you who have been clients of ours, you'll know that our mantra is that time in the market is a much more successful plan than trying to time the market. And so we want you to capture the fundamental source of returns to equities, which are driven by the earnings growth of the companies that issue the equities. And so we want you to experience and take the benefit of that 9.7% return. And we want you to avoid, through an attempt to market timing, getting a less return.
Rich, thanks for sharing that content. I always find these charts so compelling and really demonstrative and reinforcing of the fact that working with a professional can help you make some poor emotional decisions and get you out of a habit of return chasing, which doesn't serve you well. So thank you for that. Well, we're nearing the end here. And as we close out, perhaps we could just share a couple of final thoughts. And I perhaps think of this more of an invitation. Again, many of you are familiar with us. You work with us, your current clients. You're familiar with our website, libertywealthadvisors.com. Take a peek at our site if you haven't looked at it in a while. We have a lot of great content on there, not only about these adjacent areas outside of portfolio management, about broader, more holistic financial planning. We also have some information under news, events, or blogs. We're pushing out content that we want it to be educational for you and to be a resource for you, but then also by extension, your loved ones, your friends and family. We want you to reach out to us first with any questions, certainly. And then also another invitation as far as if there was anything today that you'd like to know more about, you want to go a little bit deeper, you're concerned about IRMA, you want to calculate that and sharpen that pencil a little bit further, please connect with us. There's many ways in which you can do that. Simply clicking on the contact us button on our homepage is definitely an efficient way of getting a hold of us and getting our attention. After today's presentation, we will be circulating a recording of today's content. That's another great way you can pass along to friends and family. To share with them the overall message and importance of more holistic financial planning. We do this all the time and are super passionate about it. I'm sure you could tell by our speakers today, there's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge that we're happy to share and help any client, any friend, family achieve their goals and dreams for a healthy and happy retirement, I should say. So please seek us out. All right, with the few minutes then that remain, we can get into some questions that we have. And actually, I'll stop screen sharing here in just a moment and we can get right into those questions. All right, let me go back here. All right. So Rich or Ashley, let's go through a couple of them. Question for you. We have one. What do you think of online calculators for illustrating income withdrawals? Do you think these are typically pretty accurate?
So I can take a crack at that one. I think that they, in general, they can be helpful, but they're limited, and that's because they're asking questions that are more quantitative in nature, which is very important, but they're not as good as the qualitative aspects of what I think is a critical element of planning. And the more we work with clients, the more we recognize that everybody's different, everybody has unique circumstances and objectives, and the devil's in the details. And it is very common for the first half hour we spend with a client. I'm thinking ahead. I'm trying to be open-minded and objective and not jumping to the conclusion, but I'm, thinking ahead of the likely where we're going to end up. And then you spend another half hour or another hour, and then I realized that, that initial plan would not have been correct. That, so the devil's in the details, and we think it's very important to work with a trusted human planner who can focus on everything that's unique about you and your objectives.
Yeah, well said. And sure, you could say some tools, maybe simplistic can be helpful, but then when it comes to based on everything that we talked about today, and that was just a quick overview of some of the planning content, you really do need some more robust tools at your disposal to really evaluate and optimize, some of the decisions that you'd be facing in retirement. What about this one? What do you think about a standard withdrawal rate of 5% from your portfolio? Is this a good rule of thumb?
I can take this one. And I think in general, and if you worked with me, we talk about the 4% withdrawal rate. And I think that's an industry standard or an industry rule of thumb. And the idea there is that you're distributing growth in the portfolio. So you're not eating away at principal. However, it's a rule of thumb. And like Rich just alluded to, you know, we shouldn't look at any of these decisions in a vacuum. And there are so many different factors that impact retirement and retirement planning. And it's so important to, you know, take a deep dive and to account for some of the what if scenarios. What if this happened or what if that happens? Because that can dramatically impact a financial plan.
Right. What about, all right, we've got another one here. I think we've got some time here to allow for that. This one's about Social Security. Can you take Social Security at any age, at any time? Or benefits need to be taken 62, 67, 70. I think that question is asking, or in other words, do you have to take it on those respective birth dates? Is how I'm
Great.
interpreting this. Yeah.
Yeah. So good question. And the answer is that you just need to take, or you can start taking benefits when you turn 62, and you have to start taking benefits when you turn 70. You can take it anywhere in between, or you can, you know, declare that you're taking it anywhere in between. And then it'll be, depending on when you take it, the benefit will be adjusted for your age that you're taking it. One thing though to be aware of is that once you start taking the benefit, you can't change course. So if you're 62 and decide you want to start taking the benefit, then you can't take it for 2 years and then say, you know what, I want to stop and I'm going to pick up again when I'm 70. Once you start, you have to continue.
There used to be some of those historical fancy pants, shall we call it, strategies. You know, I think those were sunsetted a handful of years ago.
Yeah, I think a restricted account application and a suspended account application or something like that. Those are no longer.
A lot more straightforward now. Yep. Okay. And lastly, we have a final one that came through. I am curious about charitable donations. I've heard this is a good way to escape RMDs. Do you recommend doing that? I kind of like how that question was worded.
I can take this one. And we do a lot of qualified charitable distributions for our clients typically once they're of RMD age. But one thing that did not change with the Secure Act is that you are eligible to do QCDs at age 70 and a half. And a QCD is going to reduce your income. So it can be a great way if you're already donating to charities to reduce some of the taxes that will come from taking those required minimum distributions.
Dual purpose, right? You can still serve your charity, but you're not having to pay income tax on the amount that you're donating. Who doesn't like that? Okay. All right, good. All right. Any other final questions? I'm taking a peek. All right, folks, it looks like that's it. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Also appreciate your feedback. At the end, there's, I believe, a little brief survey coming out your way. We'd love your feedback as far as what you'd like to see more of, or if you'd like to see me squawking less on these things. I'm happy to oblige, folks. We want to be a resource for you. So thank you for your time this afternoon. Have a wonderful day. All right, bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.